Before Elizabeth became the Virgin Queen, before the jeweled portraits and the defeat of the Spanish Armada, she was a royal child whose place in the Tudor dynasty changed almost overnight. Elizabeth was born at Greenwich Palace on September 7, 1533, the daughter of King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Her birth was celebrated, but it was also a disappointment to those who had expected the long-awaited male heir. Henry VIII had broken with the authority of Rome and transformed England's religious order partly to secure this marriage and the legitimate son he believed it would produce. Instead, Anne Boleyn gave birth to a daughter. For the first years of her life, Elizabeth was treated as a princess and maintained in a separate royal household. But the security surrounding her depended entirely on her mother's position. In May 1536, Anne Boleyn was convicted of treason and executed. The accusations against her are widely regarded by historians as deeply unreliable and politically driven. Before the execution, her marriage to Henry VIII had been annulled. Elizabeth, only 2 years and 8 months old, was therefore declared illegitimate and removed from the direct line of succession. The change was immediate. The child once presented as the future of the Tudor dynasty was no longer officially a princess. Her household was reduced, and her position depended upon the changing wishes of a father who rarely saw her. The following year, Jane Seymour gave Henry VIII the son he had wanted. Prince Edward now stood securely ahead of both Elizabeth and her older half-sister Mary. For Elizabeth, the birth of a male heir made the throne appear more distant than ever. Yet she was not neglected intellectually. Elizabeth received one of the finest educations available to a royal child. She studied Latin, French, Italian, history, rhetoric, philosophy, and theology. She developed an exceptional command of languages and learned to express herself with precision, an ability that would later become one of her most effective political weapons. Her education also unfolded during a period of religious uncertainty. England had separated from papal authority, but the beliefs and practices of the kingdom continued to shift. Elizabeth learned early that religion was not merely a matter of private faith. It could determine loyalty, legitimacy, imprisonment, and death. Henry VIII's final wife, Catherine Parr, helped bring the royal family together and supported the education of the king's children. In 1544, Parliament restored Mary and Elizabeth to the succession after Prince Edward, although neither daughter was formally restored to legitimacy. Elizabeth was again a possible heir, but only behind her brother and sister. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, the 9-year-old Edward VI became king. Elizabeth entered the household of Catherine Parr, who soon married Thomas Seymour, the new king's ambitious uncle. Seymour began behaving toward the teenage Elizabeth with a familiarity that contemporary witnesses considered improper. His conduct included entering her chamber and engaging in flirtatious physical behavior. When Catherine Parr recognized the danger of the situation, Elizabeth was sent away from the household. The episode could have destroyed her reputation. In Tudor England, the honor of a royal woman was a matter of state. Any suggestion of scandal could be transformed into evidence of conspiracy or treason. Elizabeth responded with caution beyond her years. She denied wrongdoing, controlled her words, and avoided giving investigators the confession they wanted. At 14, she was already learning the central lesson of her life. At court, affection could conceal ambition. Family could become danger. And survival depended not only on what a person believed, but on what they allowed others to prove. In January 1549, Thomas Seymour was arrested and accused of treasonous ambition against the government of the young king Edward VI. His behavior toward the 15-year-old Elizabeth was exposed during the investigation, and members of her household were questioned. Elizabeth herself was pressed to admit that marriage or conspiracy had been discussed. She refused to provide evidence that could be used against her. Thomas Seymour was executed in March 1549, but Elizabeth emerged from the scandal with her reputation largely intact. The experience hardened her instinct for caution. She learned to answer difficult questions without surrendering more information than necessary. She learned that servants could be interrogated, private conversations could become state evidence, and a royal connection could turn affection into treason. Meanwhile, the reign of Edward VI pushed England more openly toward Protestantism. The Book of Common Prayer was introduced, religious images were removed, and services increasingly followed Reformed doctrine. Elizabeth's own education and beliefs placed her closer to the Protestant settlement than to the Catholic faith of her older half-sister, Mary. Edward VI's health deteriorated in 1553. Because Mary remained Catholic, Edward and his advisors feared that her accession would reverse the religious changes of his reign. A succession plan therefore attempted to exclude both Mary and Elizabeth and transfer the crown to their Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey. When Edward died in July, Jane was proclaimed queen. But the plan collapsed within days. Mary gathered support, claimed the throne under the succession established during Henry VIII's reign, and entered London as queen. Elizabeth publicly supported her half-sister, understanding that Mary's victory also protected Elizabeth's own place in the Tudor succession. Lady Jane Grey was deposed after only 9 days. At first, Mary treated Elizabeth with outward affection. But religion soon placed distance between them. Mary restored papal authority and Catholic worship. Elizabeth conformed publicly when required, but her Protestant reputation made her a natural focus for those who opposed the new government. The danger became immediate in early 1554. Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion against Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain. The uprising was defeated, but the government suspected that Elizabeth might have known of the conspiracy or allowed rebels to use her name. No convincing proof of her involvement was produced. Yet innocence was not always enough when a possible heir could become the center of opposition. On March 17, 1554, Elizabeth was taken to the Tower of London, the same fortress in which her mother and Boleyn had spent her final days. Elizabeth wrote to Mary protesting her loyalty and asking that her sister reject those trying to turn them against each other. She was kept under tight control, uncertain whether interrogation might be followed by execution. The symbolism was impossible to escape. Her mother had entered the Tower as a condemned queen. Lady Jane Grey had recently died there. Now Elizabeth waited behind the same walls, accused not of an action that could be proved, but of being someone others might follow. After approximately 2 months, she was removed from the Tower and taken to Woodstock, where she remained under guarded confinement. Later she was allowed greater freedom, though Mary's ministers continued to watch her carefully. Much of Mary's reign was spent under some form of restriction or suspicion. Elizabeth survived by saying little. She avoided open rebellion. She did not permit supporters to transform her into a martyr. And she waited. When Mary died on November 17, 1558, the 25-year-old Elizabeth became Queen of England and Ireland. The former prisoner had outlived the men who questioned her, the governments that feared her, and the succession crises that had repeatedly threatened her life. She had reached the throne. But she inherited a kingdom divided by religion, weakened by war, surrounded by powerful enemies, and already demanding that its unmarried queen choose a husband. On November 17, 1558, Elizabeth received the news that Mary I was dead and that the crown had passed to her. 3 days later, at Hatfield, she addressed the nobles and counselors who had come to acknowledge their new sovereign. Elizabeth spoke of the burden placed upon her and promised to govern through careful advice. She also made clear that her council would remain small enough to act effectively. On that same day, she appointed William Cecil as principal secretary, beginning one of the most important political partnerships of the Tudor age. Elizabeth entered London to widespread celebration. But the public festivities concealed the seriousness of her position. England's finances had been weakened by war. Calais, the last English possession in France, had been lost during Mary's reign. The country was divided between Catholics, moderate reformers, and Protestants who had returned from exile expecting the new queen to complete the Reformation. Elizabeth also faced questions about her legitimacy. Catholic Europe did not recognize the annulment of Henry VIII's first marriage in the same way the English government did. To many Catholic rulers, Elizabeth remained the daughter of an invalid marriage and therefore possessed a questionable claim to the throne. Her coronation procession through London on January 14, 1559, was designed to answer those doubts. Pageants presented Elizabeth as the rightful heir of the Tudor dynasty, a restorer of peace, and a ruler chosen to guide England away from religious conflict. The following day, she was crowned at Westminster Abbey. The ceremonies were not merely celebrations. They were public arguments for her legitimacy and authority. The most urgent question was religion. Elizabeth was personally committed to Protestant rule, but she understood the danger of moving too quickly. England had changed its official religion repeatedly under Henry VIII, Edward VI, and Mary I. Each change had produced new oaths, new punishments, and new enemies. The Queen therefore pursued a settlement that restored Protestant government while retaining enough familiar ceremony to avoid unnecessary disruption. In 1559, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy. It rejected papal authority and recognized Elizabeth as Supreme Governor of the Church of England. The title was carefully chosen. Her father had used Supreme Head, but Supreme Governor allowed Elizabeth to assert control without entering every theological dispute surrounding a woman's authority over the Church. The Act of Uniformity followed. It required public worship to use a revised Book of Common Prayer. The new service was based largely on the Protestant Prayer Book of 1552, but it restored or preserved certain elements that could appear less offensive to traditional worshippers. This was compromise, but it was not modern religious freedom. Attendance at the established church was compulsory, and refusal could bring financial penalties. Clergy and officials were expected to recognize royal supremacy. Elizabeth hoped that outward obedience would create political stability, even when private belief remained more complicated. The settlement satisfied neither extreme. Committed Catholics rejected the separation from Rome. More radical Protestants believed that too many ceremonies and church structures had survived. Elizabeth accepted this dissatisfaction because she did not intend to surrender control of religion to either side. The former prisoner had become the supreme governor of the English Church. She had inherited a divided kingdom and answered it not with complete tolerance, but with a controlled middle path enforced by royal authority. It was the first great test of her reign, and it revealed the method she would use again and again. Move carefully. Delay when necessary. Give no faction everything it demanded, and ensure that the final decision belonged to the Queen. From the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, marriage was treated not as a private choice, but as a matter of national survival. England needed an heir. A royal marriage could secure a foreign alliance, reduce uncertainty over the succession, and protect the Tudor dynasty from rival claimants. Yet marriage also threatened Elizabeth's independence. A foreign husband might pull England into continental wars, while an English husband could elevate one noble family above every other and divide the court. Elizabeth understood the danger clearly. She had watched the marriage of Mary I to Philip of Spain produce resentment and rebellion. She had also seen how quickly a royal woman could lose authority when ministers expected her husband to become the true political leader. When Philip of Spain suggested marriage after Mary's death, Elizabeth rejected him. Other possible husbands included King Eric XIV of Sweden, Archduke Charles of Austria, and several French princes. Elizabeth allowed negotiations to continue when they served diplomatic purposes, but she repeatedly delayed any final commitment. Marriage became one of her most useful political instruments, a promise that could improve relations without ever becoming a wedding. The most important man in her personal life was not a foreign prince. It was Robert Dudley. Elizabeth had known Robert Dudley since youth. Both had been imprisoned in the Tower of London during Mary I's reign, and after Elizabeth became queen, she appointed him Master of the Horse. The position kept him close to her during court ceremonies, travel, and daily life. Their intimacy attracted immediate attention. Robert Dudley was intelligent, ambitious, athletic, and openly favored by the Queen. Courtiers noticed how frequently Elizabeth sought his company. Foreign ambassadors sent reports suggesting that she might eventually marry him. But Robert Dudley already had a wife. Amy Robsart had married him in 1550. On September 8, 1560, she was found dead at the bottom of a staircase at Cumnor Place. A coroner's jury concluded that she had died accidentally after falling and breaking her neck. No reliable evidence proved that Robert Dudley or Elizabeth had arranged her death. But political reputation did not depend on proof. Rumors of murder spread across England and Europe. Any marriage between Elizabeth and Robert Dudley would now appear to confirm the worst accusations. The death that made him legally free to marry also made a royal marriage politically dangerous. The succession crisis became more urgent in October 1562, when Elizabeth contracted smallpox at Hampton Court Palace. For several days, members of the government feared that the 29-year-old queen might die without naming an heir. She survived, but the illness exposed the weakness at the center of the Tudor state. There was no husband. There was no child. And there was no universally accepted successor. Parliament repeatedly urged Elizabeth to marry or publicly identify who should inherit the crown. In 1566, a joint delegation of lords and members of the Commons approached her directly. Elizabeth responded angrily. She considered the succession part of the royal prerogative, not a question Parliament could force her to resolve. Naming an heir could create an alternative center of loyalty. The chosen successor might become the focus of dissatisfied nobles, foreign powers, or religious factions waiting for Elizabeth to die. Her refusal frustrated ministers, but it preserved her authority. As long as Elizabeth remained unmarried, every proposed marriage remained possible. As long as she named no heir, every claimant depended upon her favor. Over time, her unmarried state was transformed from a political problem into part of her public identity. Elizabeth presented herself as a ruler devoted entirely to her kingdom, a queen whose marriage was symbolically to England itself. But the succession question did not disappear. Beyond England's northern border stood a Catholic queen with Tudor blood, a royal marriage, and a claim many considered stronger than Elizabeth's own. Her name was Mary Stuart. And soon, the struggle over marriage and succession would become a struggle between two queens. Mary Stuart was everything Elizabeth feared in a successor. She was a crowned queen, the granddaughter of Henry VIII's elder sister Margaret Tudor, and the mother of a legitimate son. To many Catholics, who rejected Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn, Mary possessed a stronger claim to the English throne than Elizabeth herself. After the death of her first husband, King Francis II of France, Mary returned to Scotland in 1561. She was a Catholic ruler governing a kingdom whose political and religious leadership had become increasingly Protestant. Elizabeth watched developments across the northern border carefully, knowing that Mary's marriage could reshape the balance of power. In 1565, Mary married her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Their son James was born the following year. The child united the royal blood of both parents and became heir to the Scottish crown, as well as a future claimant to England. But Mary's marriage soon collapsed into violence and mistrust. In March 1566, Darnley and a group of conspirators entered Mary's chamber at Holyrood Palace and murdered her Italian secretary, David Rizzio, in her presence. Mary later described the killing in a letter to Elizabeth. Less than a year later, Darnley was found dead following an explosion at Kirk O'Field near Edinburgh. Evidence suggested that he had been killed before or during the destruction of the house, but responsibility remained disputed. Suspicion quickly fell upon James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. When Mary married Bothwell only months later, many Scottish nobles turned against her. Her forces were defeated. She was imprisoned at Loch Leven Castle and compelled to abdicate in favor of her infant son, who became James VI of Scotland. Mary escaped in 1568, raised another army, and was defeated again at the Battle of Langside. She then made the decision that would shape the remainder of both queens' lives. Mary crossed into England and appealed to Elizabeth for protection. Elizabeth was placed in an impossible position. To support Mary's restoration would defend the principle that subjects should not overthrow an anointed monarch. But restoring a Catholic queen in Scotland could endanger Protestant England. Allowing Mary to travel abroad might give France or Spain a powerful figure around whom an invasion could be organized. Elizabeth therefore ordered that Mary be kept under guard while an inquiry examined the accusations surrounding Darnley's death. The proceedings did not produce a final public judgment of guilt or innocence. Mary remained in England, treated with the outward respect due to a queen, but denied her freedom. Her presence soon became a focus for English Catholic opposition. In 1569, powerful northern nobles launched a rebellion. They sought to restore Catholic worship, release Mary, and possibly arrange her marriage to Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. The rebellion collapsed, and Elizabeth's government answered it with severe punishment. Mary had not commanded the uprising, but her existence had given the rebels a possible replacement for Elizabeth. The danger intensified in 1570 when Pope Pius V excommunicated Elizabeth and declared her subjects released from their allegiance to her. The conflict was no longer simply between two rival queens. It had become part of a wider struggle between Protestant England and Catholic Europe. A year later, the Ridolfi plot proposed overthrowing Elizabeth with foreign military support, placing Mary on the English throne, and marrying her to the Duke of Norfolk. The conspiracy was uncovered. Norfolk was executed in 1572, while Mary remained under increasingly close supervision. Elizabeth had refused to name a successor because she feared creating an alternative center of loyalty. Now that alternative lived inside her own kingdom. The two queens would never meet. But for nearly 2 decades, each would live beneath the shadow of the other. For most of Elizabeth's reign, England and Spain were not formally at war. Yet by the 1570s, their relationship had become a dangerous contest fought through diplomacy, religion, rebellion, espionage, and violence at sea. King Philip II ruled the most powerful monarchy in Europe. His territories included Spain, Portugal after 1580, large parts of Italy, the Spanish Netherlands, and vast possessions across the Atlantic and Pacific. England was smaller, financially weaker, and divided by religion. Elizabeth understood that a direct war with Philip could place her throne at risk. The most immediate source of tension lay across the English Channel. The provinces of the Netherlands had rebelled against Spanish rule. Some opposed taxation and centralized government, while many Protestants resisted religious persecution. Elizabeth sympathized with the rebels, but she feared the consequences of openly supporting subjects who had risen against their lawful monarch. She also feared that if Spain crushed the rebellion, Philip would control ports from which an invasion of England could be launched. Her answer was deliberate uncertainty. Elizabeth permitted money, weapons, and English volunteers to reach the Dutch while continuing to negotiate with Spain. She did not want Philip to dominate the Netherlands, but neither did she want France to replace Spain there. Her policy was designed not to achieve a perfect victory, but to prevent any great Catholic power from controlling the coastline opposite England. Marriage diplomacy became part of that strategy. During the late 1570s, Elizabeth considered marrying Francis, Duke of Anjou, the younger brother of the French king. A French alliance might restrain Spain and provide assistance to the Dutch. Elizabeth appeared personally attached to Francis and allowed the negotiations to advance further than many counselors expected. The proposed marriage caused intense opposition in England. John Stubbs published a pamphlet condemning the match as a danger to the Protestant kingdom. Elizabeth treated the publication as an attack on royal authority. In 1579, Stubbs and his publisher were sentenced to have their right hands cut off. The punishment demonstrated that even when Elizabeth invited advice, she would not tolerate public attempts to dictate her marriage. The negotiations with Francis continued, but the marriage was finally abandoned. At the same time, English activity at sea was becoming increasingly difficult to separate from war. John Hawkins and Francis Drake had already challenged Spanish power in the Atlantic. Both men had participated in voyages that trafficked enslaved Africans to Spanish America. linking England's early maritime expansion to violence and human exploitation. In December 1577, Francis Drake sailed from Plymouth on a voyage secretly supported by Elizabeth and private investors. During the expedition, he attacked Spanish ships and settlements along the Pacific coast of the Americas, capturing an immense quantity of treasure. He returned to England in September 1580 after completing the first English circumnavigation of the globe. Spain regarded him as a pirate. Elizabeth regarded him as an asset. On April 4, 1581, she visited the Golden Hind at Deptford and arranged for Francis Drake to be knighted aboard the ship. The ceremony celebrated navigation and enrichment, but its diplomatic message was unmistakable. England was publicly honoring a commander who had seized Spanish wealth. Conflict was also growing inside England. Catholic missionary priests entered the country from seminaries in continental Europe. Some came primarily to minister to English Catholics. But Elizabeth's government increasingly suspected that religious missions could assist foreign invasion or political conspiracy. Sir Francis Walsingham built an intelligence network to uncover those threats. His agents watched foreign embassies, intercepted correspondence, used informers, and infiltrated groups suspected of disloyalty. Under Walsingham, secrecy became a weapon of the state. In 1583, the Throckmorton plot was uncovered. The conspiracy involved plans for a foreign-backed invasion, the release of Mary Stuart, and the removal of Elizabeth. Francis Throckmorton served as a link between English Catholics, Mary's supporters, and foreign representatives. He was arrested, tortured, convicted of treason, and executed. Bernardino de Mendoza, the Spanish ambassador, was expelled for his involvement in hostile intrigues. The discovery strengthened the belief that Elizabeth's assassination might be followed immediately by invasion. In 1584, leading English subjects signed the Bond of Association, promising to punish anyone involved in an attempt against the Queen's life and anyone who might benefit from her death. The warning was directed above all at Mary Stuart. Meanwhile, the Spanish army in the Netherlands continued to advance. In August 1585, English fears intensified after Spanish forces captured Antwerp, one of the most important cities in the region. Elizabeth could no longer depend upon secret assistance alone. On August 10, 1585, England concluded the Treaty of Nonsuch with the Dutch rebels. Elizabeth promised troops and substantial financial support. In return, the English received control of strategic cautionary towns, including Brill and Flushing, as security for their expenditure. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was sent to command the English forces in the Netherlands. Elizabeth wanted him to assist the Dutch without appearing to seize sovereignty over them. When Robert Dudley later accepted the title of Governor-General from the Dutch States General, the Queen reacted angrily because his action made English intervention appear more aggressive than she intended. The Treaty of Nonsuch marked a decisive change. England was no longer merely sending secret money or allowing unofficial volunteers to cross the Channel. Elizabeth had committed royal soldiers and royal funds against Philip II's forces. The Anglo-Spanish War had begun. Elizabeth had spent more than 25 years trying to avoid this moment. But the Dutch rebellion, maritime conflict, religious conspiracies, and Spanish power had narrowed her choices. The Queen who preferred delay had finally chosen resistance. And Philip II began preparing the force that he believed would bring her reign to an end. By 1586, Mary Stuart had spent nearly 18 years under English confinement. To Elizabeth's ministers, she was no longer merely a rival claimant. She was the living center of repeated conspiracies. A Catholic queen whose name could unite foreign soldiers, English rebels, and assassins around a single objective, Elizabeth's removal. Sir Francis Walsingham was determined to obtain evidence strong enough to end the danger permanently. Mary's correspondence was closely controlled, but Walsingham's agents created a secret channel through which letters could pass between her and Catholic supporters. The messages were written in cipher and concealed from Mary's guards. She believed she had finally found a secure way to communicate with the outside world. In reality, the channel was part of Walsingham's intelligence operation. Every letter was intercepted, copied, and deciphered by specialists working for the English government. Among them was Thomas Philippes, a skilled cryptanalyst who reconstructed the symbols used in Mary's correspondence. Tudor espionage had become sophisticated enough to turn secrecy itself into a trap. The man at the center of the conspiracy was Anthony Babington, a young Catholic gentleman. Babington and his associates planned to rescue Mary, organize foreign support, and kill Elizabeth. In July 1586, Babington sent Mary a coded explanation of the plan. Mary's reply discussed the proposed uprising and approved the broader attempt to secure her freedom. The deciphered correspondence became the government's central evidence that she had accepted a conspiracy involving Elizabeth's assassination. Once Walsingham possessed the letters, the trap closed. Babington and the other conspirators were arrested. They were convicted of treason and executed in September 1586. Mary's rooms at Chartley were searched, and her papers, including more than 100 ciphers, were seized. Mary was transferred to Fotheringhay Castle and placed on trial before English commissioners in October. She denied being an English subject and argued that, as an anointed Scottish queen, she could not legally be tried for treason against Elizabeth. She also protested that the original letters were not produced before her and that she had been denied legal advisors. Her objections did not alter the outcome. Mary was found guilty of conspiring against Elizabeth's life. Parliament urged the Queen to carry out the sentence, but Elizabeth hesitated. Executing a crowned monarch could establish a dangerous precedent. It could anger Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, and strengthen Philip II of Spain's justification for war. Above all, Elizabeth understood that once the order was carried out, it could never be reversed. In February 1587, Elizabeth finally signed the death warrant. The council sent it to Fotheringhay, and on the morning of February 8th, Mary Stuart entered the Great Hall dressed for execution. She declared herself faithful to the Catholic religion, prayed before the witnesses, and was beheaded. When Elizabeth learned that the sentence had been carried out, she reacted with fury. She claimed that her secretary, William Davison, had released the warrant without her final command. Davison was imprisoned, while Elizabeth presented herself as horrified by the death she had authorized with her own signature. Whether her anger was genuine, political theater, or both remains disputed. For almost 20 years, Elizabeth had kept Mary alive because killing her seemed too dangerous. Now Mary was dead. But her execution did not remove the threat from Catholic Europe. It gave that threat a martyr, and brought England one step closer to invasion. By the summer of 1588, the conflict between Elizabeth and Philip II had moved beyond secret plots, intercepted letters, and privateering raids. Philip was preparing an invasion. The execution of Mary Stuart strengthened his claim to act as the defender of Catholic Europe, but the causes of war were broader. England had supported the Dutch rebellion, attacked Spanish possessions, seized Spanish treasure, and sent soldiers into the Netherlands. Philip now intended to remove Elizabeth, restore Catholic rule, and end England's interference in his empire. His plan depended upon coordination. A vast fleet would sail through the English Channel under Alonso Pérez de Guzmán, Duke of Medina Sidonia. It would then meet the experienced army of Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma, stationed in the Spanish Netherlands. Parma's soldiers would cross the Channel and land in England. The Armada contained approximately 130 vessels carrying sailors, soldiers, weapons, horses, and supplies. It was imposing, but its mission was complicated. The fleet had to preserve enough strength to protect Parma's crossing, while Parma needed warning, transport vessels, and a secure route through waters watched by Dutch and English ships. England had received months of warning. In 1587, Francis Drake attacked Cadiz and damaged ships and supplies being prepared for the expedition. The raid delayed Spain's plans, but did not destroy them. By May 1588, the Armada was ready. Elizabeth appointed Charles Howard, Lord Howard of Effingham, to command the English fleet. Francis Drake served as vice-admiral, while experienced sailors such as John Hawkins and Martin Frobisher held senior positions. The English commanders relied on more maneuverable vessels, and attempted to use cannon fire at a distance rather than allowing the Spanish to close, board, and fight hand to hand. When the Armada entered the Channel in July, it sailed in a defensive crescent formation. The English fleet followed and attacked near Plymouth, Portland, and the Isle of Wight. These engagements damaged some vessels, but did not break the Spanish formation. Medina Sidonia continued toward Calais, where he anchored and waited for news from Parma. But Parma was not ready to embark. His army lacked a safe deep-water port, and Dutch vessels watched the coastal approaches. The Armada could not remain at Calais indefinitely, exposed to English attack and changing winds. During the night, the English sent burning ships toward the anchored fleet. The fireships caused panic. Spanish captains cut their anchor cables and scattered to avoid destruction. The following morning, the English attacked near Gravelines. Their gunfire damaged Spanish ships and prevented the Armada from restoring its original formation. The Spanish fleet was not annihilated at Gravelines, but it had lost the opportunity to unite with Parma. Strong winds and the continued pressure of English ships drove the Armada into the North Sea. Medina Sidonia could no longer return through the Channel. The fleet was forced to sail around Scotland and Ireland before attempting the long journey back to Spain. The return voyage became a disaster. Ships already damaged in battle encountered storms, dangerous coastlines, hunger, disease, and shortages of fresh water. Several vessels were wrecked along the Irish coast. Thousands of men died during the expedition, although exact totals remain uncertain. Later English propaganda presented the victory as an almost miraculous deliverance. Weather had indeed devastated the retreating fleet, but weather alone did not defeat the Armada. Spanish communication failures, the inability to collect Parma's army, English naval pressure, Dutch resistance, disease, and inadequate supplies all contributed to the failure. While the threat of invasion remained, Elizabeth visited the army assembled at Tilbury on August 9, 1588, according to the English calendar then in use. The most famous surviving version of her speech was recorded later, so its exact wording cannot be verified with complete certainty. Yet the central image endured. Elizabeth standing before her soldiers and declaring that although she possessed the body of a woman, she had the heart and stomach of a king. She did not remain hidden inside a palace. She appeared before the men expected to defend her throne and tied her own survival to theirs. The Armada's failure transformed Elizabeth's reputation. Portraits, medals, sermons, and official accounts presented her as the Protestant queen protected by divine favor. The victory gave England confidence and created one of the most powerful legends of her reign. But Spain had not been destroyed. Philip II still possessed enormous military and financial resources. The war would continue for another 15 years, bringing failed English expeditions, heavy costs, and further bloodshed. The Armada was not the moment England became master of the seas. It was the moment Elizabeth survived the greatest invasion threat of her reign and turned survival into immortality. The defeat of the Spanish Armada gave Elizabeth the image of an invincible queen. Portraits showed her surrounded by pearls, ships, crowns, and the globe itself. Poets praised her as Gloriana, while court ceremonies transformed an aging monarch into a symbol of eternal strength. But behind that carefully constructed image, the final years of her reign were marked by military failure, economic pressure, political rivalry, and growing uncertainty over the succession. In 1589, England attempted to turn its defensive victory into an offensive triumph. Elizabeth supported a large expedition commanded at sea by Francis Drake and on land by John Norris. Its objectives included destroying the Spanish ships that had survived the Armada, encouraging a revolt against Philip II in Portugal, and possibly occupying the Azores. The expedition failed. The English attacked La Coruña, but did not destroy the main Spanish fleet at Santander. They then moved toward Lisbon, where the expected Portuguese uprising never appeared. Disease, poor coordination, shortages, and resistance weakened the force. The survivors returned without achieving their principal objectives, while investors, including Elizabeth herself, suffered serious losses. The celebrated victory of 1588 had not made England capable of defeating Spain wherever it chose. The war continued. English ships raided Spanish trade, troops fought in the Netherlands and France, and military spending placed increasing pressure on the crown. The later 1590s also brought economic decline and disagreement within Elizabeth's council. The image of a peaceful golden age concealed a kingdom burdened by taxation, wartime costs, poverty, and uncertainty. The greatest military crisis now emerged in Ireland. Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, led a powerful resistance against the expansion of English royal authority. The conflict became known as the 9 Years' War. O'Neill and his allies combined Gaelic political interests, Catholic identity, and hopes of Spanish assistance into the most serious Irish challenge of Elizabeth's reign. Elizabeth turned to Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. Young, proud, and ambitious, Essex had become one of the Queen's most prominent favorites. Elizabeth admired his confidence, but often distrusted his judgment. Their relationship mixed affection, rivalry, and repeated confrontation. In 1599, Essex was sent to Ireland with a vast army and broad authority to suppress the rebellion. Instead of achieving a decisive victory, he exhausted men and resources in unsuccessful operations. He later negotiated directly with Hugh O'Neill and returned to England without Elizabeth's permission. Essex believed that his personal access to the Queen could save him. He entered her chamber before she was fully prepared to receive him, expecting to explain his actions face to face. But the old intimacy no longer protected him. He was questioned, deprived of offices, and placed under confinement. As his political influence collapsed, Essex became desperate. On February 8, 1601, he left his London residence with armed supporters and attempted to raise the city against those he described as the Queen's corrupt advisors. London did not join him. The rebellion disintegrated within hours. Essex surrendered, was convicted of treason, and was executed at the Tower of London on February 25, 1601. Elizabeth had signed the death warrant of a man she had once favored deeply. Whether she grieved privately cannot be known with certainty. What is clear is that she did not allow personal affection to survive open rebellion. That same year, Parliament confronted the Crown over royal monopolies, exclusive commercial privileges that had allowed favored individuals to control the sale of certain goods and raise prices. Elizabeth withdrew some of the most unpopular grants. On November 30, 1601, she addressed members of the House of Commons in what became known as the Golden Speech. Rather than defend power alone, she presented her reign as a relationship of loyalty between monarch and subjects. She declared that the glory of her crown was that she had ruled with their love. The government also passed the Poor Relief Act of 1601, requiring parishes to collect funds for people unable to support themselves. It was an attempt to impose greater order on a problem that charity alone could no longer manage. Elizabeth had survived conspiracies, invasion, rebellion, and war. But the people who had shaped her reign were disappearing. The conflict in Ireland remained unfinished. And the Queen was approaching 70 without a child or publicly named heir. The Virgin Queen had become a living legend. And England was already preparing for a world without her. By the beginning of 1603, Elizabeth had ruled England for more than 44 years. Nearly everyone who had helped shape the early decades of her reign was gone. William Cecil had died in 1598. Robert Dudley, Francis Walsingham, Francis Drake, and many of the commanders associated with the Armada victory were already dead. The Queen remained at the center of government, but the court surrounding her belonged increasingly to a younger generation preparing for the succession. Elizabeth still refused to announce an heir publicly. Naming a successor could weaken her authority during her lifetime, creating a second court around the person waiting to replace her. Yet the outcome was becoming clear. James VI of Scotland was Protestant, already an experienced king, and descended from Henry VII through Margaret Tudor. He also possessed something Elizabeth had never produced, children who could continue the dynasty. Robert Cecil, the son of William Cecil and one of Elizabeth's most influential ministers, had been communicating secretly with James. The purpose was to ensure that the Scottish king would succeed without rebellion or a disputed election. Elizabeth herself maintained diplomatic contact with James. Her last known letter to him, dated January 5, 1603, was conciliatory, even though she still refused to identify him formally as her heir. During the early months of 1603, Elizabeth's health declined. She suffered from weakness, loss of appetite, and an illness affecting her throat. The exact cause of her death cannot be established with certainty. Contemporary evidence has led some historians to suggest quinsy, a serious infection associated with an abscess near the tonsils, but this remains a diagnosis made centuries after her death. Elizabeth withdrew to Richmond Palace. Her counselors needed certainty about the succession, but later stories describing her final declaration must be treated cautiously. One tradition claimed that she indicated James VI through words or gestures. Yet the peaceful transfer of power had already been prepared, and James was widely expected to inherit whether Elizabeth clearly named him or not. In the early hours of March 24, 1603, Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace. She was 69 years old. Within hours, her counselors proclaimed James VI of Scotland as James I of England. The transition occurred without the Civil War, foreign invasion, or rebellion that ministers had feared for decades. England and Scotland remained legally separate kingdoms, each retaining its own institutions. But they now shared the same monarch in what became known as the Union of the Crowns. The Tudor dynasty had ended. On April 28th, Elizabeth's funeral procession moved through London to Westminster Abbey. Her coffin, covered in purple velvet, was carried on a chariot drawn by 4 grey horses. A crowned funeral effigy represented the Queen above it, preserving the image of royal authority, even as her body was taken for burial. Contemporary accounts described enormous crowds and widespread public mourning. Elizabeth was initially buried near her grandfather, Henry VII. James I later commissioned a monument for her, and her coffin was placed in a vault shared with her half-sister Mary I, the Catholic queen who had once imprisoned her. The sisters who had represented opposing religious settlements now rested beneath the same monument in Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth's reign did not create an age of uninterrupted peace or universal prosperity. Her government imposed religious conformity, executed political opponents, expanded English intervention in Ireland, and participated in the beginnings of overseas colonization and the trafficking of enslaved Africans. The war against Spain continued beyond her death, and many of her subjects experienced taxation, hunger, and economic hardship. Yet she had also inherited a vulnerable kingdom and left behind a more stable Protestant monarchy. She had survived questions about her legitimacy, imprisonment, rebellion, assassination plots, and the threat of invasion. Through calculated delay, political performance, skilled advisors, and her own command of language, she turned the apparent weakness of an unmarried female ruler into a source of authority. She never married. She never produced an heir. And she never permitted a husband, parliament, foreign king, or court favorite to rule in her place. The empire she defied was more powerful than her kingdom, but it failed to remove her. Elizabeth entered history as an unwanted daughter whose mother had been executed and whose legitimacy had been denied. She left it as the Virgin Queen, a monarch who transformed survival into legend and gave her name to an age.